Hello, this is Dr. Payne, finishing up the lecture from Chapter 10. So again, we started last time with talking about Aquinas and various scholastics who were boldly seeking to have faith, seeking understanding. They sought to know the truth, even if that wasn't the truth. They wanted to hear it first. So we have Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, his Summation of Theology, where he embodies a scholastic search, asking hard questions, taking objections seriously in order to find what is actually true, because God is the God of all truth. Again, this suggests there's a lot of confidence in the high medieval period of faith and higher education going together in this period, not being afraid of tough questions. Now, turning to those who cared less about the truth than people like Thomas Aquinas, we have kings and leaders in the Roman Catholic Church. So first, we talked about two kinds of kings who embody this new high medieval period sense that kings should have more authority than they did in the early medieval period. And that's first the English kings, following after Henry the Conqueror, who became the king of England after coming from Normandy. He's a Norman, and he conquers the land. Now, a word about the Normans that we hadn't talked about last time. Norman comes from the word Norseman or Northman, which was another word for Vikings, coming from Scandinavia. So the Normans were originally Vikings, came to Normandy in northern France, were called Normans because of their ancestry, and were Christianized. They were converted to Christianity and became integrated into the French system in France. Now, these folks who came from Normandy then to England intermingled with Anglo-Saxons, and the mixture of Anglo-Saxon and Norman French became Old English, which is the basis, the foundation for modern-day English. Old English into Middle English, Shakespearean English, and then the Queen's English that we have today. Now, two tactics used by William the Conqueror in the conquest of England to assert his royal authority. First, the Domesday Book in 1086, which was an accounting of all sorts of possessions throughout the land. That enabled him to tax more effectively, and through his system of conquest and taxation, the king gained about a fifth of all the land in all of England. Secondly, the same year, 1086, there's also the Oath of Salisbury Plain, where not only his vassals, the lords that were subject to him as King of England, but also the sub-vassals, the knights under those vassals, swore direct allegiance to the king. So no longer were these knights pledged to their lords, who then were pledged to the king, but now all of these folks, both the lords and their knights, are directly pledged in loyalty to the King of England, William the Conqueror. Now, one of William's successors was Henry II. He's very powerful. In two ways he expands the power of the English monarchy. First, he uses the exchequer, this checkered kind of chess board, this checkered cloth that was over the table where accounting was done. So in other words, the exchequer refers to the permanent, orderly king's accounting, the permanent king's treasury, and the chancellor of the exchequer, who's responsible for overseeing the collection of taxes. So first you have an orderly taxation service. Secondly, you have the movement of courts from local courts to the king's courts throughout the country. And this creates a common law. No longer is it there's this different law in Salisbury and a different law in Liverpool and a different law in London. Now there's common law throughout the land. This also means that the king's able to collect fees when people are levied fees in court, which is through fees and taxes, expanding the power of the king. Also, you have a failure of Henry II, and that is particularly against the church. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest bishop in all of England, opposed the king's efforts to not only take common courts, but also church courts, and put those under the prerogative of the king's courts. Instead, clergy were tried in separate church courts, and not only did Henry II have himself opposed by this cleric, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, but Thomas Becket was murdered by troops apparently on Henry II's orders, and this caused the Pope to intervene, and Henry II had to do acts of public penance, public apologies. He was actually whipped as part of his penance, and he did not try anymore to assert the royal authority over these church courts. Another of the successors of Henry, John, was very much a failure in expanding the power of the monarchy. He lost the lands that England had in France to the French king, Philip II, who we'll talk about in a bit. And he was forced to sign the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. And the Magna Carta in 1215 basically acknowledged the obligations as well as the rights that were due a king to his vassals, and that John was not living up to those rights and obligations to his subjects. You can read about that on 271. There's excerpts from the Magna Carta. Now, you also have another king in the late 1200s. This is King Edward I, and he sought to expand the power of the monarchy by getting more income. And in order to do this, he actually traded some of his power for more money. And what he did is he established the Parliament, which was made up of representatives from the lords, that is the lords and the bishops, and also the commoners, so knights and townspeople. And this Parliament, with its House of Lords and House of Commons, was able to levy more taxes than the king had been able to previously, but also gave to Parliament, both the lords and the commoners, a bit of say in how the country was run. So it's a shared governance structure between the king and the representatives of the people, between the king and the Parliament, which is unique in England in Europe at this time period. France, however, was growing the power of the monarchy in itself, and doing so through an expanded bureaucracy. The Capetian kings are the kings of this time period, and these kings, particularly Philip II Augustus, expanded the French monarchy by taking away lands from the English monarchy, which was dual governing part of its lands in France and also in England itself. So this gave the opportunity for the French kings to expand their power, to directly expand into their domain, right, into their domain, these lands which had been under the English crown. You have a lot of holdings, even Normandy itself. Again, the Normans conquered England from Normandy. Normandy falls, Maine also in the north of France, also Aquitaine and Anjou in the west of France fall to the Capetian kings. You have the saintly king of France, Louis IX, who rules from 1226 to 1270, and he fights corruption and also sponsors 2 failed crusades. We'll talk more about the crusades in a bit. One of this guy's heirs was Philip IV, called Philip the Fair. Apparently he looked pretty, he was fair, and he perfected the bureaucracy of France into 3 different divisions, which we won't go into. But another contribution was, in addition to expanding and empowering his bureaucracy, he formed the Estates General, which was kind of like a one-off version of the English Parliament, where you'd get together representatives from the 3 classes, the nobles, the clergy, and the townsfolk, and they would vote to raise additional taxes. So this was a clever strategy for the king to raise more money, but again, it only happened every once in a while. It wasn't a regular power-sharing deal like the English Parliament was. So by the end of the 13th century, by 1300, the French monarchy was the most powerful monarchy in all of Europe, extremely powerful. Meanwhile, you have German dynasties, the Hohenstaufens, which is one of my favorite names of any dynasty. The Hohenstaufens are this dynasty in Germany in the 12th and 13th centuries, and they are trying to centralize the power of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, after Constantine, the title of Holy Roman Empire came up again after the year 1000, but it was becoming an elected position. So various principalities and kind of noble land holdings throughout Central Europe, in the area that's now Germany, elected an emperor. And sometimes these nobles wanted a weak emperor so they could effectively run their own affairs within the empire. And so that's what happened. There was a Holy Roman Emperor who was very, very weak, and a number of these, and there was expanding decentralization under the Holy Roman Emperor. What happened with the Hohenstaufens is they tried to re-centralize the monarchy to repeat the success of Charlemagne, create a powerful, really functioning Holy Roman Empire under a single powerful monarch who actually ruled over his lords, much like what's happening in France. So Frederick I Barbarossa, or Redbeard. So Frederick I Redbeard is one of the first of these Hohenstaufens who becomes Holy Roman Emperor and really tries to use that position to centralize power under the monarchy. He expands by taking tribute from northern Italy after trying to take over that territory, and uses the money from northern Italy, which again is a capital of commerce as well as learning with its universities, uses the money from northern Italy to advance his ambitions. One of his sons, Henry VI, ends up ruling over lands from Sicily in southern Italy all the way to Germany, northern Germany, but he dies after a few years, and it is Frederick II, another son of Barbarossa Redbeard, who becomes extremely powerful. However, Frederick II, though brilliant, is really not focused on running Germany. He focuses on trying to consolidate Italy under his rule. And so what happens by his death in around 1250 is thereafter Italy falls into disintegration and Germany becomes largely decentralized, with local lords and princes effectively running affairs with a very weak Holy Roman Emperor. And the Pope reestablished his control over central Italy. Now, there are various states developed in this period. You can read about them in your book. You've got Christian kingdoms in Denmark and Norway. The Vikings have been converted to Christianity and, generally speaking, stopped their Viking raids. By the years after 1000, you have Hungary. The Magyars had invaded a lot of Eastern Europe at this time period, and they settled down in the greater kingdom of Hungary, also Christianized, and Poland, another kingdom in Eastern Europe that's Christian. Russia is also developing in this time period, and it adopts, unlike these other territories, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the same practice of the Byzantine Empire, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, in the 12th and 13th centuries, you also have the largest single unified land empire ever, as far as we know, in human history, the Mongol Empire. And under Genghis Khan and his grandson, Kublai Khan, you have this huge empire that goes all the way from Beijing in China and Canton in southern China, across Central Asia to Persia. They, at one point, take Baghdad, and up north into Russia all the way to Kiev, modern-day Ukraine. It's this enormous land empire, the largest single unified one-piece land empire ever in human history. But it breaks up over time, divides into 4 khanates or rules, and has very little lasting impact on southern and western Europe. But again, it's a huge empire, needs to be noted. Now, beyond the Holy Roman Empire, you had in central Italy, again, the Papal States. The Pope is still the king of central Italy in this time period, and some people buy his lands, want to take it, but he's still the king there. And South Italy and Sicily are variously controlled by Normans, actually, who somehow made their way from northern France to southern Italy and Sicily and took those lands from Muslims in Sicily and others in southern Italy. And southern Italy becomes kind of a flashpoint between Byzantine, that is Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Catholic Christianity, and Islam, because all 3 of those empires were competing in southern Italy. Now, speaking of competition between Christians and Muslims, let's turn to Spain. And I'm kind of bouncing over different parts of the chapter here, so I'm not going to follow the chapter's chronology. Okay. Now, in Spain, called Iberia, that's the name of the whole peninsula where Spain is, in southwestern Europe, it had been conquered by Muslims in the 700s, but by the 11th century, by the 1000s, you have Christian states emerging there in northern Spain, and they are going to work their way down, like kind of fingers going from north to south across Spain, and those kingdoms have various names. Aragon and Catalonia today, kind of in northeastern Spain, Navarre, Castile, Leon, and then Portugal in the far west. And in order to encourage these conquests, the kings of these various kingdoms, which had different policies towards Muslims, but are still taking Muslim land, they have repartimientos, which is gifts of land and goods, particularly houses and money, to people who are conquering land or settling in the newly conquered lands from Muslims, and also fueros, or rights, to local communities. So the king is ensuring local authority over their own lands. Meanwhile, from this precedent of taking over Muslim lands in southern Italy and Sicily, taking over Muslim lands in Spain, there are these distinct conflicts between Christians and Muslims called the Crusades, kind of the capital C. Now, a crusade is in general a war to defend or advance Christendom at the expense of non-Christians, usually Muslims in this case. And in the 20th century, the language of crusades was used as kind of a metaphorical, spiritual crusades of the heart, like the Billy Graham Crusades. Billy Graham isn't attacking Muslims, but he is saying we want to convert hearts and minds. So that's kind of been a spiritualized concept. Much like in Islam for some Muslims today and in the past, jihad, which is kind of the Islamic equivalent of crusade, the holy war for defense or expansion of Islam, is now kind of internalized in a spiritualized sense. But nevertheless, at this time period, the Crusades are a series of wars of Christians from Western Europe going into the Middle East, particularly the Holy Land around Jerusalem and Palestine, and establishing Christian crusader states. And these crusades last for about 200 years, from the 1090s until the 1290s. Okay, that's the Crusades. Okay. Now, why the Crusades? First off, we need to learn about Islam, and secondly, we need to learn about the Byzantine Empire before we talk about the Western Europeans who actually engaged in the Crusades. So, let's talk about Islam. The Abbasid Caliphate, that's the second of the great caliphates. After the Umayyad Caliphate, you have the Abbasid Caliphate. It's declining by the year 1000. And it's being replaced eventually by two different Islamic empires. First, the Fatimids in North Africa, based in Egypt, and then the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks are from Central Asia, but they settle in modern-day Turkey, which is why their language is more Central Asian, but they convert to Islam and take up this territory in kind of Eastern Turkey as their power base. Now, by 1055, the Seljuk Turks had actually effectively overthrown the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Caliph still has authority as a religious figure, but it's the Turks that are actually in control of the eastern part of that empire. And they take Baghdad. And instead of taking the title of Caliph, because there's still a Caliph who's a religious figure, there's a new title for Islamic rulers of these empires after the year 1050, and that's Sultan. That means holder of power, right? No longer are you kind of this spiritual successor of Muhammad. You are one who holds power. You are a kind of a secular leader who happens to be Islamic. Now let's talk about the Byzantines. So they're facing increasing threats from not so much the Abbasids as the Seljuk Turks, who are a lot more organized than the Abbasids were. Now, the Byzantine Empire is Eastern Orthodox. It's not Roman Catholic, and there have been rifts over the centuries between the Eastern and Western halves of the Church. Now, the Eastern Church, while in a powerful empire, it had this big controversy over iconoclasm, right? Many Muslims were opposed to religious icons of their figures, right? So Christians, in part in an attempt to satisfy Muslims, and in part because of theological concerns about idolatry, they banned the use of icons in the Eastern Roman Empire. The Roman Catholic Church had never banned the use of icons, and probably never will, right? But this had been a controversy in the Eastern Empire, and so this caused a rift between Rome in the West and the Byzantine Empire in the East. And even though the Eastern Byzantine Empire eventually said, no, icons are okay. We're not going to be iconoclastic anymore. We're not going to break the icons. We're going to keep them. Still, that had been a rift. Also, there's theological debates, including some words in the Nicene Creed, which I'm not going to go into, and insisting on the Pope's supremacy. This really rankles for the Eastern Roman Empire. It's one thing for the Western Church to add, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, filioque, that clause, and of the Son, in the Creed. That's annoying, but what's more annoying is the Pope insists, I'm the top dog, I'm the boss, you need to submit to me as the Pope. The Eastern Roman Empire is not buying it, and the Archbishop of Constantinople is called the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, kind of the Eastern Pope. And what happens in 1054 is they excommunicate each other. The Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople both claim to be the top dog of the church, excommunicate each other. There is idea that you're banned, you're no longer accepted as brothers in Christ, basically, anymore. However, the situation changes in the Eastern Roman Empire. In 1071, there's this huge battle, the Battle of Manzikert, decisive victory for the Seljuk Turks, who then expand into most of modern-day Turkey. And the Byzantine Empire is worried that they themselves might fall to the Turks. While there is stabilization brought to the empire in 1081 by a new emperor called Alexis Comnenus, Alexis I stabilizes the empire, but he can't launch an effective counterattack against the Turks. So he calls to the Roman Catholic Church for help. And this begins the Crusades. Okay, so Pope Urban II, he's no fan of the Patriarch of Constantinople, but when he hears Christians in Eastern Europe in the Byzantine Empire calling for help, he calls in 1096 or 1095, late 1095, calls for a crusade against the Turks, against the Muslims in the Middle East. Why does he do that? There's various reasons. Maybe he wants to increase the power of the Pope. Maybe he wants to get really angry, violent knights out of Europe. Instead of fighting other Christians, let's fight a common enemy. There's various reasons people suggest. We don't really know why. But Pope Urban calls for this crusade in 1095. And some people popularly say that he said in one account, Deus vult, God wills it. And this really stirs up the crowd, and they want to go fight in the Crusades. Why? Because Pope Urban II says if you fight in this crusade, or even if you're on your way to fight the crusade and you die, you will automatically go to heaven. Okay, so that's a pretty good incentive to fight in this war. And indeed, he inspires many people to fight. The first group of people who are inspired are not so great. This is called the People's Crusade or the Peasants' Crusade in your book. It's led by this really weird guy called Peter the Hermit who rides on a donkey, and he's a charismatic preacher, this French monk. He rides a donkey, he claims to have a letter from Christ authorizing him to do a crusade. He probably didn't have the authorization of Pope Urban II, but he thinks Jesus is for him. And the only people that are really hurt by Peter the Hermit's People's Crusade or Peasants' Crusade are Jews. Jews are attacked because they're not Christians. They're theologically kind of similar to Muslims because they believe in one God and not a Trinity. And so Jews are attacked in these cities in Northern Europe, in Germany. And although there are some clergy in the Catholic Church, bishops even, in the cities of Mainz, Speyer, and Worms, and they all try to protect Jews, but lots of Jews are killed, hundreds of Jews are killed, and many forced to convert to Christianity, at least publicly. So this is pretty grim stuff. The People's Army eventually gets to the Byzantine Empire, and they cause lots of problems. There are about 40,000 of these people, mostly peasants and mostly not professional soldiers. They muddle their way through the Byzantine Empire, and they fight Byzantine garrisons. They have riots that they incite, and they generally cause havoc until in August 1096, Emperor Alexios says, hey, I'll give you a boat across the water. You can go fight the Turks over there. Good job. He just wants to get them out of his hair, and you can guess how the battle goes. The Seljuk Turks destroy this army. Most of the people there are killed or captured and sold into slavery by Muslim forces, and only a small fraction of these people make it back to the Byzantine garrisons. And given their history, you might say good riddance. The first crusade, the first official crusade, however, starts from 1066 to 1096 to 1099. And this is much more successful. It takes more time to prepare. It's largely led by French troops, but some other European troops as well. And these are knights. These are professional soldiers, not a bunch of rabble that are attacking Jews in the neighborhood. Okay? And these guys conquer a lot of territory in the Holy Land, really along the far eastern Mediterranean coast, like all that territory on the far east of the Mediterranean, and some inland as well. And they set up crusader states, from Edessa in the north to going from north to south, Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and then Jerusalem. That's the furthest south. And there are a bunch of massacres created by the Crusaders in Jerusalem. In particular, the siege of Jerusalem was really horrific. Over 10,000 people executed. You can read about this in your book on page 293. Just horrific accounts of the Crusader massacres in Jerusalem. And the crusade disappoints a lot of people. It obviously disappoints Muslims who are losing land in the Holy Land. It disappoints the Byzantine emperor, who asked for the Crusades in the first place because he wanted those lands for himself. But instead, the Crusaders set up their own Crusader states along the coast that are actually Roman Catholic, not giving any allegiance to the emperor over in Byzantium, in Constantinople. And who benefits from these? Well, it elevates tensions between Muslims and Christians, but it really benefits northern Italian merchant states like Genoa and Venice that make a lot of money supplying the Crusaders, because that's expensive business, supplying these largely coastal Crusader states in the eastern Mediterranean. And this is going to continue, again, for 200 years. These later Crusades, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, 8th Crusade, etc., these are all pretty much failures, without exception. The Fifth Crusade initially succeeds, but then ultimately fails. And they're usually in reaction to Muslim gains in this period. So the first of the Crusader states to fall is Edessa in 1144, and it falls to the Turks. That triggers the Second Crusade, but that's a failure. It fails to retake Edessa. Saladin the Great is a huge figure who overthrows the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt and sets up his own dynasty. And Saladin is also a great military champion against the Crusaders. He takes a lot of Crusader land and even takes Jerusalem itself in 1187. Now, he does this without anything like the massacres that Christians had done when they took the city about a century earlier. Just credit where credit's due. Saladin is not into massacring civilians on the scale that the Crusaders did. However, this inspires the Third Crusade because Jerusalem has fallen to the pagans, to Muslims. And so there's a new crusade. It largely fails and only succeeds in that there's this agreement that Saladin promises pilgrims who are Christian access to Jerusalem. So even though Muslims control Jerusalem, Christians now have pilgrimage access. And we'll talk more about what a pilgrimage is later. Now, when Saladin dies, Pope Innocent III, who we'll talk about later too, he launches a Fourth Crusade, which is really bizarre. It actually ends up attacking Constantinople. Again, the power that had called for crusades in the first place is now sacked by other Christians, by Western Christians, who set up this pro-Roman, Roman Catholic Latin state of Constantinople for like 50 years until 1261. And there were other crusades after the Fourth Crusade, but they are, again, largely failures. Not much to say about them. Now, what are the causes and consequences of the crusade? We're not exactly sure exactly what the motives of everyone involved were, but we do know that one reason for crusaders to go was if you die in the fight, you go to heaven. And if you win, you gain control over these lands. So win-win-win. But a big consequence of the Crusades was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment. Again, Jews were attacked by the first kind of the initial People's Crusade before the First Crusade, the pre-Crusade, Peasants' Crusade. And Jews were continuing to be attacked throughout the time of period of the Crusades, and anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish sentiment grows greatly over this time period, as well as conflicts between Jews and Christians, and Muslims as well. Now, during this medieval era, let's talk more about the Roman Catholic Church. This is this high medieval period between 1000 and 1300 is the high period of the Roman Catholic Church. The papacy never gets stronger than it is now. And the churches are obviously entwined with politics and have been since the age of Constantine in the 300s. Many monasteries have been hit hard by Viking invasions and then invasions by the Magyars and Muslims later on. And in 910, there's this movement to reform monasteries. That monasteries have been devastated financially. Some of them have become less disciplined and corrupt. And so there's this movement, the Cluny Reform movement, that starts off based on this Eastern French monastery in the town of Cluny. And it tries to eliminate these abuses and focus on monks doing not just manual labor, but also copying manuscripts. Be serious about preserving literature, which had fallen into kind of disrepair earlier, that monks had been doing this less vigorously. Copying manuscripts and also more community worship. Don't just have people doing private prayer, which can lead to abuses. People might go off and just do whatever. But if you're doing community prayer, you're disciplined in a community, you're more likely to stay the course. Now, by the 11th century, there's also a serious problem called lay investiture, where even though the Roman Catholic Church is supposed to be appointing people to clergy appointments, you have civil leaders, lay leaders, non-authorized, non-church leaders who are actually appointing people to church positions. And this is because, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, because the Holy Roman Empire doesn't have a whole lot of direct control over all of his nobles, if you're appointing bishops, that gives you authority and other people in the church. That gives you official people who you can work with as allies to increase your power, other than other nobles. So Pope Gregory VII says, I'm going to end this practice in the 11th century. And he says that the Pope has the authority to unseat any earthly ruler, right? Who doesn't obey the divine commands of the Pope. This leads to the investiture controversy, which clashes Henry IV, a Holy Roman Emperor who's very powerful, against the Pope. The Pope saying, no, you don't have the power to appoint church officials, only I do. Only the Roman Catholic hierarchy does. But again, they clash. What happens is that Pope Gregory VII excommunicates Henry IV, and basically that would deny him the sacraments of the church, which basically means you don't count as a Christian right now. And that would undermine his authority as a Christian king with the other lords, who once again expand their power at the expense of the emperor. So what happens is Henry IV is a smart guy. He gets out on his knees in the snow at the retreat of Canossa in Italy in 1077. And after 3 days of being out in the snow, begging the Pope to forgive him, apologizing, the Pope forgives him. He's no longer excommunicated. And within 3 years, the Pope and Henry are literally fighting each other with armies. So it doesn't long-term solve the problem. This problem of investiture, though, is solved in 1122 when there's a new Pope and there's a new Holy Roman Emperor, and basically they decide to make a compromise. The church gets to pick out who's actually going to take the seat. However, that bishop then needs to go to the civil leader and get his vestments, literally his clothes, the outward signs of office from your secular leader, and you, of course, pledge allegiance to that secular leader. So there's a compromise in the investiture controversy. Still a lot of lay power, but the church actually picks who gets to have the position. And this tension between kings versus the Pope is going to explode centuries later in the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Pope's power is mainly exercised through the papal bureaucracy. The top of that is the papal curia. Those are kind of super bishops called cardinals who are answerable only to the Pope. Below them are people who are called archbishops. Archbishops are over several different bishops. Each bishop has a diocese, or kind of a bishopric, that they oversee. And in this diocese, there are many different parishes. And over each parish, kind of congregation, is a priest. So this hierarchy goes from top to bottom. Cardinals under the Pope, and cardinals, by the way, wear red robes. And it's after this red color that the American cardinal bird is named. So cardinal birds are named after cardinals with their red robes. Under them, archbishops. Under them, bishops. Under them, priests. A tightly organized hierarchy and bureaucracy. Now, the most pope of all the popes in history, the most powerful pope, was Pope Innocent III. We've mentioned that he was around earlier, who had launched one of the Crusades. He helped launch the Fourth Crusade. Now, Pope Innocent III believed that popes were over all earthly authorities, and he used this analogy. The sun is the main source of light, and the moon has light because it reflects the light of the sun to the earth. That's why the moon is bright sometimes and dark others, because it's obscured, right? So the moon's light only reflects the sunlight. In the same way, all earthly leaders only have authority because the Pope gives them that authority, and the Pope can take away that authority from those earthly rulers. He actually said that I'm the sun, and all earthly leaders are like the moon. Okay, so he used his power very effectively under Philip II, that French Capetian king. And he basically said, when the French king tried to divorce his wife, he put the entire country, the entire nation of France, under interdict. In other words, the priests throughout France cannot they cannot administer the sacraments. And that's everything from baptism, Eucharist, confession of sins and forgiveness of sins, last rites if you're about to die, including forgiveness of sins there, marriage, holy orders to people, these sorts of essential sacraments that are necessary for salvation, according to Roman Catholic theology. These are outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace. And if you don't have those sacraments, then you're not, in a way, connected to God spiritually, because you're not eating the body and blood of Christ. You are not receiving forgiveness of sins from priests. And this is a huge problem. So Philip II backs down. He doesn't want France under interdict, under basically excommunication. And so he says, okay, I'll stay married to my wife. He's still going to have other mistresses, but he's still going to stay married officially to his wife. Now, Innocent III also expands papal power, not only through signs over earthly kings like Interdict of France under Philip II, but also religious orders. There's a bunch of them. Cistercians, Franciscans, Poor Clares, Dominicans, and Beguines, all under Innocent III. Now, there had been other monastic orders before, but Cistercians say we're going to be way stricter. The Benedictine order is okay, but they're kind of lax. They're not really intense and dedicated. So the Cistercians say we're going to be strict, strict, strict. The most famous Cistercian is Bernard of Clairvaux, and he's totally dedicated to God. Right? He's also a brilliant writer and great preacher. And he says this great quote from the text, which I want to quote to you. "Arise, soldier of Christ, get up off the ground and return to the battle from which you have fled. Fight more boldly after your light and triumph in glory." Right? This militant understanding of Christian faith. Now, holy women, women religious, also called nuns, they're also arising in the period of Pope Innocent, which is kind of the early, late 1100s, early 1200s. And many of them are highly educated aristocratic women, including Hildegard of Bingen. She's in Germany. And she not only is a very well-educated woman who writes books, but she writes about her mystical visionary experiences in 3 different books. Also, she's an abbess. She is over a group of nuns, or a nunnery in Germany. And she's also a composer. She composes Gregorian chants. And Gregorian chants are the main kind of religious music at this time period. So if you hear old medieval music, it tends to be Gregorian chants. So she composed music that was usually done by men. She writes about her mystical visions, again, usually a thing done by men. And she's the abbess ruling over a group of nuns in her nunnery, right, in her convent. Also, there were other orders, the Franciscan and Dominican orders. Franciscans follow this guy named St. Francis. He was the son of a rich merchant family in northern Italy, in Assisi. And he leaves his family, gives away all his wealth to the poor, and establishes an order that is advocating extreme poverty. The Dominicans also are a mendicant order. They focus on extreme poverty. And the Franciscans have a sort of a female auxiliary group, the Poor Clares, who are nuns, like Franciscans are monks. And the Poor Clares are founded by a woman named Saint Clare. She's also from Assisi. She also is on the same track as Francis, and they're kind of parallel brother-sister orders. Also, the Dominicans, they're more educated than the Franciscans. They're also mendicant. They are extremely poor. They get their money from begging or from donations. They're not rich. But the Dominicans are focused on education. They were founded not by an Italian, but by a Spanish man named Dominic de Guzman, hence Dominicans. And he was learned and specialized in refuting heresy. So Dominicans are all about fighting heresy. Franciscans and Poor Clares, they focus on poor people, preaching to the poor. Dominicans focus on fighting heretics. And a lot of Dominicans become involved in the Inquisitions of later periods, especially the Spanish Inquisition later on. There's another group that's mendicant. It's kind of a very, very poor group called the Beguines. And they beg like the Poor Clares, and they're groups of women like the Poor Clares. But the Beguines are not bound by an order of life, right? They don't have a rule of life. They're not sworn into a holy order. They're a voluntary group of women that pray. They live very simply. But again, they just beg or do menial tasks for money, and are very popular because you can join the Beguines and then leave the Beguines whenever you need to. It doesn't have the same kind of long-term commitment as other orders. Now, taken together, all these religious groups, Beguines, Dominicans, Franciscans, Poor Clares, and the Cistercians, are doing a lot of things beyond just praying and fighting heresy. They also do basic social services, especially Franciscans and Poor Clares. They maintain social services for the poor, like feeding them, clothing them, caring for the sick, caring for lepers. Only these religious orders were doing that. The secular government had nothing to do with caring for the poor. Only monks were willing and able to do this on a consistent basis. Of course, they also copied manuscripts and kept libraries. They kept learning alive, and they were good instructors as well. Some of them were missionaries too. But they did a lot of things to preserve and advance Christendom in this time period. Beyond this, you had the so-called secular clergy. Monks were called regular clergy because they had a rule of life that they had to follow. It was very strict. The secular clergy, that means in the world. Secula seculorum, the world is what secular means. And so these secular clergy in the world were affecting the lives of all sorts of ordinary people, from monarchies all the way to ordinary townsfolk. And they administered these 7 sacraments. Again, baptism, confirmation, communion, confession, marriage, holy orders, and last rites. And these were, again, outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace. Very important to not only be a Christian, but to be saved. You needed these signs. You need to be baptized. You need communion. You need confession of sins and forgiveness of sins by the priest to continue as a functioning Christian. Now, within the system, you also have saints who are seen as especially holy people, models for ordinary people to look up to, and even to pray to. If you feel like, I don't want to pray directly to God, that feels almost irreverent. It feels too bold. So I'm going to pray to saints as intermediaries to who I feel are closer to me, who are going to pray then to God and intercede for me, right? Protestants get really nervous when people talk like this, but this is what they believe, okay? And many people still do believe this around the world. If you were a particularly holy person, also, not only did people pray to you and think of you as a person that would guide them in life, but also they'd share relics, like bones of a saint or even treasured possession of a saint. And they would keep these things and sometimes adore them and like kiss them. It's kind of gross. Like kissing a bone of a saint, like, oh, I'm so close to the saint. You feel like special grace. Now, the number one of all the saints, and they didn't have any of her relics, by the way. They didn't have any of her bones, at least. Was the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. And she was the most venerated of all of these folks, right? Now, people didn't say we worship the saints. They say we venerated them, right? We're just honoring them. We're not actually worshiping. Although some Protestants kind of see them as the same thing. The most, again, famous of these saints, the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary. And there's a lot of cathedrals named after her, including Notre Dame. By the way, Notre Dame in French means Our Lady. Notre, our, Dame, Our Lady. Our Dame, basically. Now, because a lot of people had died with their minor sins unforgiven, there was this concern, well, what happens? These sins need to be atoned for, and I didn't go to confession before I died. So there's this idea of a place called purgatory between heaven and hell, where people who are on their way to heaven, you don't go from purgatory to hell. But in purgatory, you go up to heaven, but you have to have your sins purged, burned away. And so this is a painful process that could last hundreds or thousands of years, depending on how many sins you had or what your sins were. So the Roman Catholic Church said there are various ways you can atone for sins of loved ones who have died, and that is you could go on a pilgrimage to see a holy site, or you could venerate saints' relics, or you could pay an indulgence. You could pay as a way of saying, well, I'm not going on a pilgrimage, but instead of that, I'm going to pay money to show my faith, and that'll take away years from my loved one's time in purgatory. And this obviously leads towards some financial abuses in the church. But again, it's kind of a symbolic pilgrimage or visit to a holy site where relics are. A way of expressing your devotion. And pilgrimages become not only religious devotion, but sort of like early tourism for the Roman Catholic Church. Now, let's talk about fighting heresy. The Dominicans were very much part of this. You had a lot of attacks on Jews during the Crusades, and that accelerates in the high medieval period into the late medieval period. But you also had concern about morality, particularly same-sex unions, which were kind of tolerated earlier. They were regarded as one among many sins, but now they're particularly attacked and punished, sometimes by death in this period. And that's in part because homosexuality or same-sex relationships were seen as something that Muslims did, right? And so they're particularly looked down upon in the high medieval period. There's also various groups that called themselves Christians that were really a threat to orthodoxy in the church, especially the Albigensians, named after their city of Albi in southern France. Southern France was a stronghold of this group. They were also called the Cathars. And the Cathars or Albigensians, their basic idea was dualism, right? There's good and bad in the world, and the physical world is evil. It's bad. All physical things are bad. Whereas the spiritual is made by God. That's good. The spirit is good. Our good spirits are trapped in evil bodies, and the material world is all made by Satan. It's all evil. And this is, of course, against Roman Catholic teaching, right? Because they have sacraments, which are physical things, outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace, that God made the world good. This is, traditional Orthodox Christian teaching. right? That the physical world is good. It's tainted by sin, but it's still fundamentally good and will be fundamentally redeemed by God. The Cathars don't believe that. They think all flesh is bad, all physical things are bad. And so the Roman Catholic Church decides to suppress this heresy by launching a crusade. Okay, this time not against Muslims, but against heretics, right here in Europe. And so Pope Innocent III, who else, calls for this crusade against the Albigensians or the Cathars. And even though this lasts for 20 years and many thousands are killed, including a lot of innocent people who just got caught up in the fighting, this didn't stand by the movement, so the Pope calls for an inquisition, right? A special papal inquiry to root out these heretics. And the Inquisition, a lot of them headed up by Dominicans, who are, again, experts on anti-heresy, not only preaching against it, but sometimes being involved in the process of finding and rooting out these who are guilty. And if you didn't confess, you could be, by the way, accused by anyone in the Inquisition. You'd be secretly tried and questioned by Dominican clerics. And if you didn't confess and they really thought you did it, they'd torture you. And they could torture you to extract a confession. And if you confess, then you have to do these public acts of penance to show that you're really, really sorry. You'd have to give away your lands and your goods to the church, which would then seize your lands. So there was a big incentive not to crack under the pressure, but if you did, you would at least maybe get away with your life. But if you confessed once and then were reconvicted of heresy again, then you would be burned at the stake, most likely, in a public act, an auto de fe, an act of faith. And in the autos de fe, people who had confessed heresy were publicly paraded and forgiven, and those who were sentenced to die were burned at the stake. Okay, this big public auto de fe gathering, an act of faith showing this is what happens if you stray from the fold. Okay, so why the Crusades and why this harsh treatment of heretics? Well, you think about it from their perspective. This is about saving souls, right? And if something is taking people from the true faith to heresy, is leading them to hell, what wouldn't you do to save a soul from hell? What wouldn't you say to save them? And indeed, that's the rationale of the Inquisitions against heretics. That's the rationale of harshly treating Jews, because killing some Jews but forcing others to repent, saving some souls is better than none. That's the rationale they have. You know, the ends justify the means. That's the logic being used here. And also in the Crusades, the ends of saving the Holy Land, getting pilgrims to Jerusalem, justifies the means of fighting, slaughtering people, even massacres against people, if that's what it takes to preserve our order. That's the logic used. So on that grim note, and the lecture, I hope you and pray that you will do your best to study for this exam. I hope this lecture is some way helpful. If you have any questions or comments about it, let me know. And again, have a wonderful, blessed weekend and a great time. See you for your exam on Tuesday. God bless.